housekeeping. I'm recording. A couple of housekeeping things. We will go to about 8. If you want to have your camera on, I appreciate it. As I just said, I have a lot of young adults in my home, so I feel like nobody's listening to me pretty much all of the time. So it's nice to have a visual that people are listening to me. However, I very, very much understand the desire not to have to look at yourself the whole entire hour and a half. And I understand having kids in the background. So if you prefer not to be on camera, that's totally fine too. I would ask that if you have a comment or if you have a question at all, that you please unmute yourself so that we can all listen to your comments. I learned so much from other foster parents, and I have found that if you have the question, most likely someone else does too. So please feel free to take yourself off mute and share your questions or your comments with all of us, because as I said, I really learn a lot from that. Then, like I said, we're going to go ahead and do questions at the end, or how to get credit for being here. But as a way to just double check right now, what we're asking if everyone will go back to writing their name in the chat. And that's just going to be a double verification right now while we get Bridge all set up. So if you guys wouldn't mind just doing that really quick, I would appreciate that. While you are doing that, I will just let you know that I really appreciate you taking your time to be here tonight. I know as a parent that there's probably at least 10 other things that you could be at tonight that would be worthy of your time. And so I really do appreciate you guys taking your time. I also want you to know that I think you're pretty amazing parents if you are taking the time to be here. As a parent who has tried to parent a child who has FASD, sometimes I feel like I haven't done a very good job, or I'm not meeting the standards that I've set for myself. And I want you to know that if you're here tonight, you're doing a great job, because you're taking the time to learn, you're taking the time out of your busy life to try to become the best parent you can be. And that's truly all we can ask of our parents. And so right off the get-go, I want you to know that I think you're doing an amazing job just by being here and trying. So the other thing I want you to know is I've gone to a lot of trainings for FASD. And one thing they all seem to have in common is they all tell me what FASD is, and then tell me what it looks like. And then 90% of the class is spent there. And then 10% of the class is spent on what I could do differently in my home, or how I can better help my child. This training is going to be flipped a little bit. So I'm only going to spend about 10% of the time telling you about the definition of fetal alcohol and what that looks like in your home, because I'm guessing you already know what it looks like in your home, which is why you're here possibly tonight. And then my majority of my conversation will be on what we can do in our home, what tips, what behavior modifications for us, for our children, can we do that will really benefit and make our home a more peaceful environment, make our children feel more successful, all of those things that I think we're striving for as parents. If you are kind of new to FASD and my definitions are not enough for you and you want more information there, we have lots of classes that have talked about FASD kind of 101. They're recorded and they're on Bridge. I'd be glad to help you get to them. Or there's a lot of other information out there. Or please feel free to ask questions. Just because I'm going to go over it quickly does not mean we can't pause and take a little bit more time with a couple subjects that you might have. But we will, as you can see here, just briefly touch on the definitions. But most of it, I want to spend time talking about how we can help the child. So we will go from there. So FASD, it's kind of an umbrella of a lot of different disorders that your child could be diagnosed with. You have the lowercase p, FAS, which is the partial facial alcohol syndrome. You have FAS. ARND is a much more common phrase nowadays. That's kind of the direction that a lot of doctors are going towards to diagnose. That's just kind of going to be talking about alcohol-related neurological disorders. So all of these are a collection of diagnoses that represent the range of effects that can happen to a person who is exposed to alcohol before birth. A lot of times when we're talking about children in foster care, we're not going to know the extent of the exposure. we may possibly not even be aware that there was exposure for sure. And so that can be lead to some difficulties in getting the diagnosis. When my boys were diagnosed about 10 years ago, they would not give them the diagnosis of FASD unless I had a mother who admitted to drinking when she was pregnant. The mother, of course, with everything that was going on, that was not something that she was willing to admit, so that they were diagnosed with alcohol-related neurological deficits, I could believe it was. And so that ARND diagnosis. Nowadays, they're saying that you don't need to have a mom admit to drinking while she's pregnant to get a diagnosis. But it is just more common that you'll see the ARND diagnosis, and that the symptoms and the signs, they're going to range from mild to very severe. Every child is going to have different symptoms and signs of this. Not one child with FASD looks the same as another child with it. So some signs and symptoms that you may see: low body weight. They could have sleep or sucking problems, nursing problems when they're babies, vision or hearing problems. Most of us, if you're old like me, think of FASD as more of the facial features. That is actually very rare. Most children who have FASD and have any of those diagnoses under that umbrella do not have the facial features. So if you kind of grew up thinking about that way, they've kind of gone away from that now, because they say only about 10% of children have any of those facial features that I kind of grew up thinking about FASD being. Some other signs and symptoms you might see: poor coordination, hyperactive, difficulty with attention, poor memory, difficulty in school, learning disabilities, speech and language delays. They could have a low IQ. Now, most kids who have FASD do not have a low IQ, which is very interesting. They definitely need the extra support. They definitely need the interventions that you would provide for a child who had a learning disability. But when you do the full-scale IQ test, they're not always going to show up as a low IQ. That does not mean they still don't need the supports. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit later too. They could have poor reasoning and judgment skills. They could be shorter than average and small head size. Again, I feel like a lot of this stuff, I see some of you nodding. I feel like when I'm in a training and they're telling me this, I'm like, check, check, check. I don't need to go into detail what it looks like for them to have poor reasoning skills, because I'm living with poor reasoning skills in my home, which can be very difficult. A couple things: fetal alcohol spectrum disorder mimics a lot of different disabilities. However, it is more common than, it's 2.5% more common than autism, 19% more common than cerebral palsy, 28% more common than Down syndrome, 48% more or 40% more common than Tourette's syndrome. And especially when we're talking in the child welfare system, it's incredibly common. I don't think it is acknowledged as much as it should be. I don't think it's diagnosed or labeled as much as it should be. And when we're talking about being in the child welfare arena, those numbers are much higher than even the average arena, because our children are coming from homes where there is substance abuse, where there was more likelihood of some of those substances being used. So keep that in mind. I think, when we are talking about no child looking the same or no child acting the same, a lot of times our kids are not being diagnosed with FASD, which can lead to a lot of problems. As we're going to see later on tonight, one of the main protective factors of what will indicate a child being successful with the FASD later on in life is early diagnosis. So you really want to be aware if a child has that likelihood. And we're going to talk about how FASD looks different than trauma and how they look the same, because that can be a big people can get those two things confused very often. And so we want to be very careful that we're getting the right diagnosis, and then we're getting the right help for our children as well. Because like I said, if they're having some of these same symptoms as maybe trauma, or if they're not looking like we expect a child with FASD to look, then it could be very difficult for us to know that we need to reach out and try to reach those doctors and people. So that is where getting a good diagnosis is really important. However, treatment for services for people with FASD are most effective when they address a person's specific impairments and build upon his or her own strength. So as important as it is to get that label, it is also very important that we recognize we're working with one individual child, or if you have multiple children in your home with that label, that you're working with multiple children, but each of them are going to be different. And each of the treatments that they're going to need are going to be different. So as important and as much as I'm going to stress getting that appropriate diagnosis, I also want to stress that we need to treat it child by child, that they're a person first, and then the diagnosis behind that person. So protective factors. What is going to lead to the most ultimate best outcome that we can have for a child who is diagnosed with FASD? The first one, like I said, is early diagnosis. A child who is diagnosed at a young age can be placed in appropriate educational classes and get the social services needed to help the child and his or her own family. Early diagnosis also helps families and school staff to understand why the child may act or react differently than other children sometimes. So just across the board, early intervention is incredibly helpful for all of our children, whether we're talking about autism or developmental delays, intellectual disabilities. Anytime we can start early to get them those intervention services, the outcomes are going to look a lot better. Particularly true with our children with FASD. So we want to make sure that we're reaching out to those people and getting those services that we need as quickly as possible. To diagnose FASD, doctors look for the prenatal exposure, although again, like I said, that's no longer needed to make a diagnosis. So when my boys were getting diagnosed 10 years ago, they wouldn't give them that diagnosis of FASD. But now, the research I did preparing for this, they said that's not needed. And different doctors may be caught up to that information or not, but that's what the CDC, which is where I got all of this information from, is now recommending. Another thing they're going to look at is the central nervous system problems. So those small head size, problems with attention, problems with poor coordination. Maybe they bump into things quite frequently. Maybe they have a hard time. One of my sons has a hard time knowing the space in the world, where his bubble starts and when other people's bubbles starts. So that can be part of it as well. They will also look at lower than average height, weight, or both, and they'll do the abnormal facial features. So to the point of getting a ruler out and measuring the eye, measuring the width across between their eyes, that can help in the diagnosis as well. But with that, keep in mind that we want to make sure that we're still treating the child, not just the diagnosis. The other protective factor is involvement in special education services. So children who receive special education geared towards their specific needs and learning style are more likely to reach their full potential. In addition, families of children with FASD who receive social services, such as counseling or respite, and respite is key, we'll talk more about that later, can have a more positive experience than families who do not receive such services. Now, again, I'm kind of going quickly over some of this stuff, but I did want to point out, if you have a child who's younger than 5, there is this Baby Watch early intervention. I just have the website up here so that you could look at the website address right there, and you could see that your wherever you are throughout the state, there is a Baby Watch Head Start early intervention program that you could call to see if your child qualifies. I think that's just so important that we're getting those early intervention services in there to help the child with all of the services that they may need, in addition to helping you with any services that you may need as well as you're navigating this. Hopefully, if a child still is in foster care, when they're sending out that ages and stages, they're catching if a child is behind in certain different areas. If they're not, and you are still concerned, as a foster parent, you have a right to call it and, let the team know and say, hey, I have some concerns here. I know it's not popping up on the ages and stages, but these are the things I'm seeing, and I'm wondering where we can go with that. They will recommend that you call the Baby Watch program, and you will get an evaluation. Now that automatically happens if the child is not meeting those ages and stages questionnaires that they're sending out. But if you have concerns, it's okay to let the team know that and to just see if they'll come out and do an evaluation, even if they're not popping up because of the ages and stages. So if anyone wants to get that information down, you can just go to that website up there. If you have an older child who is already in school, a great program that I really like is Utah Parent Center. They are an agency throughout the state that will help you get educational services for your child. They're an advocacy program mostly. They also do some family activities. So you can, your family can go with other children that are similar or have similar issues as your child, and do, maybe go to the park or an Easter egg hunt. But their main purpose is that advocacy. Although you can see here, they have a lot of different services that they're offering for families. But if you get to the point where you feel like your child needs to be evaluated or needs to have different services than the school is offering, and the school is pushing back for one reason or another, this is Utah Parent Center is definitely the way to go. They will help you advocate and understand what your rights are and what your students' rights are and how to most successfully get them through school. Because not all the time are they going to need an individual education plan. Sometimes they might need a 504 plan, which, if you're not familiar with those different ones, the IEP, or the individual education plan, is a federal mandated program. So it has a little bit more teeth. But sometimes when you have kids who have a typical IQ, it can be harder to get an IEP unless you have a diagnosis like ARND or FASD. A 504 plan is kind of ran through the school, but it can also allow for longer test times, or it can allow for frequent breaks during school. And so there's lots of different ways that you can get what your student needs to be successful. And sometimes I just think the schools are really overwhelmed with everything they've got going on, that they may not be able to look at your individual student and see what they need. And that's where you as parents or foster parents are so critical to their success, because you do have the opportunity to really advocate for them. So any questions about school or anything that I've gone over? Like, again, I said a little quickly, but any questions that anyone has? Okay. It's a lot, so I just wanted to make sure. Okay.
Yeah, actually I do. So I have a child who just completed 7th grade, and she's right on the border of being able to handle it, and things are overwhelming. Her biggest challenge is she does have that short-term memory loss issue. So I don't even know, like my other daughter, so I have 2 that I adopted that have FASD, and my other daughter came, they knew, like, she goes to Dan Peterson, she has an IEP, that was all like figured out. But my other little one, who could use a little bit more of a boost, like, who do I even go talk to at the school just to be like, hey, just, my kid's got this thing and could use a little bit of something.
So that is where a 504, I think, would come in really handy. So you're saying she doesn't have an IEP currently, correct?
Correct.
And probably it sounds like if she's gone to 7th grade, maybe doesn't need it.
Right. I don't think she needs a full IEP. Like her little sister has cerebral palsy and autism. Like her little sister has a ton of things, all related to this. She was born a micropreemie due to drug and alcohol use. My older daughter, the one that's 13, she had a fairly typical pregnancy minus the substance abuse. But as a result, it means she's almost there. But how do I explain it?
No, I think I get it. And that's
Like
to me
she's
where I
just
would say,
close.
yeah, that is where I would say a 504 plan would be great. Again, and that is a more school-led thing. So if you were going for an IEP, you would want to talk to the special education teacher. And then they have, I believe it's 60 days to do an evaluation. So they have all these time frames that they have to follow because it's a federal mandated program. A 504 is not so strict in their mandates, but it can still get you what you want. So the principal is kind of the one in charge of that, or they
Okay.
might at different schools, they might have someone else designated for that. But they can write up a plan that says, the teachers need to help her fill out her day planner every day. Or she needs 5 minutes at the end of class so that she can write in her day planner. Or she needs extra time in the halls so that she can get to her next class and kind of have a time to prepare and get her brain, thinking the way it needs to be thinking. So they can come up with all sorts of different accommodations. You're saying, that short-term memory is the problem. They can come up with all sorts of accommodations that will help her. And it won't be as, won't be as strict as your younger daughter, but it will be something that the school will follow through if they see that there's a need. And actually, Utah Parent Center, if you go on here and search for a 504 plan, it tells you all about it. It tells you the difference between a 504 plan and IEP, tells you how to go about getting one. That's why I love this Utah Parent Center. It just has everything you could ever need about any type of special education services.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions there? Okay. Another protective factor that the CDC mentions, I think all of us can agree and have witnessed ourselves as foster parents, is the absence of violence. So obviously, if our kids can live in stable, non-abusive households, and they do not become involved in youth violence, they're much less likely to develop secondary conditions than children who have been exposed to violence in their life. I was just listening to a podcast to get prepared for this, and they said the number one productive factor that they have found is that loving, stable home. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But they just said having that loving, consistent, stable home is the number one predictor of whether children with FASD will live successful lives or not. And I think, like I said, this absence of violence seems like a no-brainer to me, but unfortunately not all of our children live in absence of violence, but that is why it's really important for all children, but especially our children with FASD. They really need that calm environment so that they can thrive. Children with FASD need to be taught other ways of sharing their anger. Things that we may think come natural, they may not have developed learning those skills yet. And so we're going to need to teach them about that. And then the other one I mentioned is that loving, nurturing, and stable home environment. And that is where we're going to spend most of our time tonight in talking about ways that we can do things to provide this environment for them. Children with FASD can be more sensitive than other children to disruptions, changes in lifestyles or routines, and harmful relationships. Therefore, having a loving, stable home is very important with children with FASD. In addition, community and family support can help prevent secondary conditions such as criminal behaviors, unemployment, and incomplete education. So let's talk about different ways that we can do that. There's some medication that we can offer. And that's going to look different for every child. And I'm not a doctor, so I'm definitely not here to recommend any type of treatments. I'm here to just kind of give you some overviews of some ideas. So the first would be that medical care. There's going to be lots of doctors that could be involved with your child. The one that I would recommend highly getting involved is an occupational therapist. They are finding out more and more that occupational therapy can be really helpful to our kids in a lot of ways. So when I was talking about that poor coordination, or my son who has trouble with bubbles, or maybe they have sensory issues where different shirts bother them or different sounds. I've really noticed that a lot with my children with FASD, that they're very sensitive to sounds or smells. An occupational therapist can really help address some of those issues. And that's not just for children with FASD. They're finding occupational therapy to be helpful for children who've experienced trauma as well. So that's one thing I would definitely look into. And again, I can't stress it enough. The types of treatment needed will be different for each person. And you need to make sure if the child's still in foster care that you're talking through all of this with the child and family team, because we don't want to do any type of treatment that the child and family team has not agreed would be beneficial for the child. There's also lots of medication. I'm not going to talk about it too much, just because I'm not a doctor, but there's nothing that is specifically used to treat FASD. So there's not a medicine that they can say, take this pill and all of your symptoms will go away. That'd be great, but there are some that can help. So stimulants like that you would give for children who have ADHD or hyperactiveness. Sometimes antidepressants can help. Anti-anxiety drugs can help. And remember, medication can affect each child differently. And one may work really well for one child that has an FASD diagnosis and may not work for another. And again, you're always going to want to make sure that you're talking to the child and family team meeting, or at the child and family team meeting, or with your child's caseworker about any of those kind of things. And then we get to what we can do, that behavior and parent modification. And really the topic of our conversation, because I think we get into this place of our kid can't do this, or our kid won't do this, or our kid is being manipulative, or our kid is just trying to drive us crazy. Just today, I walked in after I'd been at a meeting this morning, and my daughter, who's 18, says, you know, my younger son, he wouldn't do this. I told him not to. He ate some food, and then he wanted to throw it in the trash, and she didn't want him to waste the food. And so she said he was sitting at the table, and I told him not to throw it away, and he just walked to the trash can and threw it away anyhow. It was like he wasn't even listening to me, and he was just trying to be disobedient. And I said, well, honey, why don't you come to my class tonight and I'll explain to you why that's just not the case. It wasn't a matter of that he was trying not to listen to you or that he was just trying to push your buttons. His brain did not process what she was thinking quickly enough to stop from throwing away the food and to think through, okay, if I throw this plate away, she's going to be upset with me. He loves his sister with all of his heart. He loves he wanted to go fishing with his sister, and she wouldn't take him after he threw that away. He wanted to do well for her. When kids do well when they can do well. And that's kind of something that I just kind of try to remember in my brain all the time. Kids do as well as they can. My son today really wanted to hang out with his sister. And so if he had the opportunity to kind of slow down his brain and process what she was thinking or saying, then he would have done that. It wasn't a matter of won't, it was more a matter of couldn't at that point. And so we need to start changing our mindset to recognizing what is a won't versus what is a can't. And we're going to talk about that. Some ways that we can do that are to break down everyday tasks into simple, easy to follow steps. So when I talk to my son, the first thing I will say, I'll say his name a lot of times. And then I'll say, I need you to look at me. Because if he is easily distracted, if there's TV or music on, I'm going to say something to him. And it's not that he's not listening to me, it's that his brain cannot understand all of that stuff that's coming in all at once. So I need to say, hey, Keegan, I need you to look at me. And then I tell him what I want him to do. And then I need to give him up to 30 to 40 seconds to process what I want him to do. Now, I know full well that this looks like sometimes that he's not listening to me, but it's very helpful to me to recognize that it just takes his brain longer period of time to process what I'm saying. It's not a matter of being disobedient. It's not a matter of pushing my buttons. It really does take his brain longer to process that. And so again, that change in your mindset, as a parent versus changing the child. A checklist, really, really helpful. Depending on the child's age, a visual checklist is very helpful. You can see here a morning chore checklist that I had for my son. And we went through and we picked the clip art together. So on the computer, you can just Google underwear up there at the top. And it was very step by step. Because if I say change your clothes, he does not recognize that that means all of his clothes. That just could mean his shirt. I have to be very specific in what I want him to do. If I was just to say, go clean your room, that to him is too many directions at once. I need to say, let's pick up all your toys. Now let's pick up all your clothes. Now let's get your bed made. It's just too many instructions for him all at once. So we went through and we picked up all this clip art of what I thought was important for him to do in the morning. And then he could have a visual schedule to follow. You have to be careful when you get into those teenage years that none of these strategies that I'm going to mention go into the shaming, which is very easy to do, right? Because when they're 12, they don't want to be different than their peers. And their peers might not have a visual checklist that they're having to write down to figure out how to do their chores at night. So any of these things that I mentioned, please be very careful that you're not doing it in a shameful way for your teenagers. And it may be something that has worked for you up until this point, and now they're really, really resistant to it. And it could be because they're feeling a little bit of shame. And so that's when I've had to make the switch to taking away the visual reminders and doing just a written checklist. And maybe the written checklist is behind the door versus on the mirror of the bathroom kind of thing. But keep your instructions short and to the point. So you want to say, take off your shoes, put them by your bed, and get into bed. There doesn't need to be a lot of words used, but again, be very specific. Be prepared to repeat instructions every day. My goodness, this is the one that can be very frustrating to me because I think we have done this. We have gone over this 1,000 times. There's just no way that you cannot remember that, but there is. And what we're talking about here is brain damage. And it's so helpful for me to remember that. When I teach trauma or TBRI, we talk a lot about how the brain pathways can change and how we can rewire the brain. What we're talking about with FASD is actual brain damage where there's no rewiring going on. We can teach skills and adaptations that they can use that can help them really be successful in their life, but we still are looking at a brain that's been damaged. And so when we think, I've said this 1,000 times, maybe that's what your child needs. And so we need to say it 1,001 times, which can be frustrating. I get that. But when we recognize that those short-term memories just not there like it should be, it makes it easier for us to change our brain or change our mindset into this kid is just not listening to me, into this kid needs that extra support from me. And that's really helpful to me, again, to just change my mindset. Show and tell, so important. Sometimes I need to walk my son to the bedroom that he's going to be working in because showing him what I want done is a lot easier than telling him. Watch the clock. My son loves to have the timer going. He can't tell time quite yet, but he really likes to look at the time. Be very creative in things that you're doing. My son was having the hardest time getting up in the morning, but he loves music. And you'll find that a lot of times with children with FASD, that music is very motivating to them. Music and art, they seem to do really well in that kind of sphere. And so my son could really remember music. But if I was to say, hey, you need to hurry up, we only have 5 minutes left for school, 5 minutes was a concept that he just didn't get. But if I said, you only have till this song ends, then he understood that. He knew how long that song would go. And so we made him a morning playlist. And so when Who Let the Dogs Out was singing, that was his song to go get food and water for the dogs. And then when another one was singing something else, that was his song. And he had the length of the time of the song to go get dressed. And so he knew when the time was about to be up. So it was a really creative way that worked really well for him for a long time on how to get ready in the morning. So you just have to be super creative and thinking of what will motivate this child to be successful, because that's what they're wanting to do. They're wanting to be successful, and you're wanting them to be successful. You just need to figure out tools to help both of you get there, right? Plan for the weekends. I can't stress enough how important routines are. I think routines and consistency, especially with kids who have experienced trauma, is incredibly important. I think it's doubly important with kids who've experienced trauma and who have FASD. They need to know what's next on the schedule. When they're trying to compute all these social cues that they just don't quite understand, and they're trying to remember all these rules that we have, also trying to remember what's coming next is just one more thing for them to try to fit into that brain. And when they're trying to focus on other things, sometimes it can be just so overwhelming. And plus, it really helps our kids from trauma to know what to expect next. So in the summertime, I know it's hard, but sticking as close as you can to those routines can be really helpful. On the holidays, I know it's super hard and everyone wants to sleep in. And I'm not saying don't sleep in at all. I'm just suggesting that as much as possible, try to stick to those routines and those schedules, because it can be very, very soothing for a child to kind of know what's next. And then keep a checklist for you too. Kind of keep a checklist of what's worked, what hasn't worked, what you need to remember to tell them. When you're telling them to do a certain chore, tell them the same way each time. So you want to say, clean up the table from dinner, or get the dishes off the table, whatever. Say it the same way every time so they know exactly what you're wanting. And when you say, I need you to clean the table off, you need to be a little bit more specific in that. I need you to get the plates and cups and silverware off the table and put into the dishwasher. But make sure that you're saying it in the same way every time so that they can, they know what to expect. And then that checklist is kind of the outline, the steps that you need to take and establish a routine for your child. So you want to make sure that you're following those routines and guidelines that you have set that you think would be helpful for your child. You also want to change the environment, not the child. That can be a hard one to do, because sometimes you just think, oh, it would just be so easy if the child would just do X, Y, and Z, right? But however, we're talking about our child here, and we need to recognize that brain damage has been done. And so we need to work with the child that we have and work on building their skills that they have and being really strength-based and positive about all of the positive, wonderful things about our child, and making sure that they know that they're not the problem, that maybe we need to change the environment. Maybe we need to give them different skills or different abilities, but they're not the problem that we're trying to solve. That's really important. So a couple things here is to make sure your child gets enough sleep. Again, I think this is important for all children. I think this is important for parents as well. I think we all need more sleep. And you can't force a child to sleep, and I get that. But make sure when you're doing those routines and the consistency that you're building into, like maybe you're having a bath time, maybe you're having a bedtime time story, maybe you're adding lavender to the room, the smell. Make sure that you're building those routines and consistency into your schedule so that it's more likely that they can get a good night's sleep. So with the changing the environment, not the child, if your child often has a temper tantrum in a crowded movie theater, maybe you take them to the matinee instead of the evening show. If your child always has a behavior problem when you go to a family get-together, then maybe you need to look at the child not going to a family get-together. Now, I know, because I've been in this position, I think, well, that's just so not unfair. I want the child to go with us on family outings, or I want the child to be able to experience the movie theater with all of us. However, I know when I take them to that family get together that they are not going to be able to be successful, because I've seen it. We've done it 20 times, and 20 times this child has not been successful. And 20 times I've been mad as heck as I'm dragging them out of there saying, why aren't you successful? And they're not feeling good about themselves. I'm not feeling good about myself. It's a whole blow up. When I knew going into it that my child did not have the skills and the ability to be successful there. And that is more on me than it ever will be on my child. And so I started to have to really taking a look to see how we could make it work for my child. Maybe we go for 5-10 minutes, and then that child and I go do something special, because I don't want him to feel left out by any means. But being in an overwhelming, large, loud, for them. So maybe it's we go get an ice cream cone and we come home afterwards. Maybe it's that we go and then him and I take some special one-on-one time in a room with no one else. However that looks for you, but make sure that you're working with your child. Maybe it's you take earplugs. One thing that we started doing is my son loves, again, listening to his music. So I have him have his headphones on. Normally I would say, oh, that's so rude. You should be playing with your cousins or listening to the older people talk or whatever. But he is very successful when he can be listening to his music. So maybe it's you take earplugs. Just make sure that you're working on looking at the environment and setting your child up for success. Because again, our children will do as well as they can. And so we want to give them all the tools that they can to be successful. Reward good behavior. When your child behaves well, praise them for their achievement. Reward them immediately. That's really important. And be sure to tell them exactly why you're rewarding them. So if you're just saying, oh, you did a really good job, they might not understand what you want to see again. Oh, you did a really good job when I told you to turn off the TV and you came right away. I really appreciate that. High five. Make sure it's a big praise that you're doing. So oftentimes when we get upset with them, our consequences or our mad voice is much louder, much animated than when we're just praising them or we're saying, oh, good job. And we kind of move along really quickly. Reverse that. Make the consequences or the negative things that you say very bland and not without a lot of hand emotions and a lot of excitement, and make the praise have all the excitement and all of the emotions and hand gestures and everything like that. Look for your child's strength. Every child has strengths and abilities, special strengths and abilities, and you really want to focus on those. Sometimes children with FASD, a lot of them have that artistic ability, have a musical abilities. Some of them are very spatially aware. So look for those and encourage them wherever you can. Encourage those strengths that you can see in your child. Give your child responsibility. All children need that responsibility in their life, but it can be very helpful to a child with FASD who feels like they're not successful in other areas of their life to feel successful in setting the table, because they know exactly what to do to set the table. They know the plate goes here, the fork goes here, the cup goes here, and they can be successful at that every single night. And so it's great when you can give them things that they know how to accomplish and that they can get done and feel that sense of accomplishment. Give your child a place to calm down. I mentioned earlier having, wanting more control over my adult children because I liked timeouts before. We've really gone away from timeouts now. And we have those calming rooms, or the calming corners is what I think they call them, the bean bags and the sound noise and Legos or some fidget toys. That's so helpful for our children with FASD. They need some place where they can kind of decompress, and it doesn't have to be a consequence. All of us need that in our life sometimes. If I go to Walmart, I need to come home and go to my calming corner. I just cannot stand all the noise and the lights and the sounds and the people touching me. And our kids are the same way. they often need that calming corner more often than we do, but they still need something so that they have a safe environment to express their feelings in. Be aware of your child's sensitivities. We kind of mentioned that. A lot of children with FASD are very sensitive to sights and smells. So my son will be able to pick up on a smell much more quickly than I can, and it can become very overwhelming to him. Lights can become very overwhelming to him. Touch, with another one of my sons who have FASD, he does not like to be touched. I kind of feels, when he's described it to me, almost like sandpaper to him. This is where occupational therapy can come in very handy, but this is also where you as a parent, if you're aware of your child and aware of kind of triggering things for them, you can kind of adapt the environment to make it a little bit more easy for them. So if going to Walmart is really stressful because of the bright lights and the people and the touching, you can go later at night, or maybe you can go on a time that's not busy. And you can adapt that environment to help them be as successful as they can. Make sure your child understands you. I just sent my son, who is so smart. He has a very typical IQ. He does pretty well in school. He's very well behaved. I sent him outside the other day and I said, I need you to get this can of paint that we have. And I showed him the color of it. And I said, it should look like this. And I sent him outside to go grab it. He came back, it's not there, Mom. I said, I know it is, we just barely bought it. I said, you know, this is the name of it. This is what it looks like, everything. And I had a 1 gallon can of paint that I was showing him as an example. And he said, Mom, it's really not there. And so I believed him, because I thought, well, okay, he says it's not there. You know, there's no reason for him to lie. He's doing as well as he can. About 2 or 3 days later, after I had bought a new can of paint, I went outside, and sure enough, the paint that I was wanting was there. It was just in a different bucket. And so because I had said, I want this paint, even though it was the same exact color, it was the same everything, it was just in a different size bucket. He did not understand that I would want that same bucket or the same paint. It didn't make sense to him. And that is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder in a nutshell. It really wasn't that he was trying to make me buy an extra can of paint, or that he was trying to be bad in any way, shape, or form. I was not detailed enough in my instructions to him. And he did not ask me for clarifying questions, which is something we're working on with him. But it was something about, or if he did not understand me. So sometimes you need to say, okay, what did I just say? Now, I used to do that all the time with this young man, and he used to just tell me, you said, do this and this and this. And when he hit 12 years old, he did not want to have to do that anymore. That to him was babyish, and nobody else had to do that. So I have to find different ways to make it work. So I'll be like, okay, so what are you going to go do now? And then he'll say, okay, I got it. And sometimes he'll repeat it back to me. Most of the time I can just see him in his brain kind of writing it down. Sometimes if it's really important, I'll say, hey, I need you to write this down while I'm talking. Texting is so helpful when they get older and they don't want to write things down or repeat things to you. And we don't want to shame them. We don't want to make them feel bad that they can't remember things. I will say, hey, this is what I need you to do. I'm going to send you a text to remind you to do it later on. Because that's a very age appropriate thing to do, is to get a text, right? And so that has been really helpful to him when he has that kind of problem. And then keep your expectations realistic. I can't stress this enough. So when we're looking at a child who has FASD, we need to figure that their developmental age is about half of what their chronological age is. Now, some parents may say, so in the instance of my son, who does really well in school, that nope, his developmental age is the same as his chronological age. And it's just not. So socially, so maybe academically, maybe he is up with 17-year-olds. Socially, he's probably a 15, 14-year-old level. With reading and comprehension, he's probably at a 14, 15-year-old level. So when we take all of those combined, we can kind of get a better idea of what their developmental level is versus their chronological level. And I think the next slide talks about that. Yeah, so right here. So we need to recognize that they may not be at that age that we think they are. So maybe their expressive language is much more advanced and more at a 20-year-old level, but their comprehension of what is being said or what they are reading is more at a 6-year-old level. Maybe their physical maturity is a little bit below. So when you average all that up, their developmental age is not going to be the same as their chronological age. And the number one thing that causes frustration for parents is when you have expectations that are inappropriate for your child. And so I think it's just so important that you really take some time to look at what do you have as an expectation for your child and what is a realistic expectation. One thing that is really hard with children with FASD is they don't have a lot of the same physical features as another child with maybe cerebral palsy would have. So in my home, I have a son who has cerebral palsy. He is 22 years old. He's in a wheelchair. He has a feeding tube. He is very obviously has disabilities. It's very helpful to me to think of him sometimes because I would never, ever go down to his room and say, you need to get up and walk. You're 22 years old. Why are you just laying down in your bed today? You need to get up and walk. And if you don't, I'm going to kick you out of this house. It would never even occur to me to do that. Yet, sometimes with our 22-year-olds that have FASD, we do that. You know, we say, oh, you're 22 years old. You're living in my home. You don't have a job. I'm going to kick you out. We need to recognize that that 22-year-old, maybe chronologically 22, but developmentally still very much needs to be in our home and needs to be under our supervision and our support. So just kind of adjust and look at those expectations. Anyone have any questions or comments on that? I don't know if anyone has any experiences of being able to do that and it working really well. I just think it's, like I said, it's so important that you figure out where they really are. And with children with FASD, recognize that this can change. So at one point you may think, oh, he's, maybe he's functioning at a 17-year-old level. And then the next day or later on that evening, they may be functioning at a 11-year-old level. And that's actually not manipulation. That's actually not pushing your buttons. It's actually part of the brain damage that they sustained when their mother drank when she was pregnant. And so that's something that fluctuation can happen, and it can be really frustrating for parents when it happens, but it can be something that happens with children who have FASD. When we're looking at that, I really like this chart because it talks about some problems that our kids may encounter, like memory problems or inconsistent performances, like I just mentioned. So we have that heuristic, and then we have our standard interpretation of that, what happened. So inconsistent performance is one that's very common with FASD children. So they perform well on one day and not on the other day. So our standard interpretation of that would be that they're just not trying hard enough. That if they really wanted it, they would just try harder. What that causes in our children, that secondary defense, is anxiety. So the next time that they're required to perform at a certain level, their anxiety is already going to be increased, therefore decreasing the chances that they can perform at that level because we've caused that anxiety in them. Let's take another one. Another thing that a lot of kids with FASD may have is they may be very impulsive. So our standard interpretation of that would be that they're a daredevil, that they just don't, they're sociopath. They just take all these risks. And then if we give them those labels, they're going to start behaving accordingly, because that's kind of the labels that we've given them. Maybe we're saying that they have memory problems, very common as well. If they would just try, then they could remember them. I know my son, we did math facts and multiplication tables for years, third, fourth, fifth, sixth grade, we were doing multiplication. One son, colors. He would have orange and he would know orange on Tuesday. And then by Thursday, it was like he'd never seen the color orange before in his life. And it would be very easy for me to say, okay, you're just playing me, or you're just trying to make this hard. Let's hurry up and get through homework. It's that mind shift that I was able to have most of the time that allowed me to say, okay, this is more of a memory problem, because if it was about them trying harder, children will do as well as they can do. It's not a can't, or it's not a won't, it's a can't. And so we need to give them the skills to be able to do those things that we're asking them to do. So some learning strategies that we can take into the school. Rehearse. So multiplication facts until you are so done with multiplication facts you can't stand it. Children with FASD often have short-term memories. Be prepared to rehearse new concept as often as necessary. So again, with my son who's in a wheelchair, I don't go downstairs ever and say, oh my goodness, I have to feed you through your G-tube again. I can't believe you're making me do this. It's such a pain to have to feed you through your G-tube. That would never cross my mind. Yet, as you can tell, I did not like doing multiplication facts day after day after day, but that was what my child needed. And so we need to kind of think of it in the same light. We're giving what our child needs to be successful. I need to feed my son through his G-tube every single night. And to me, that doesn't even faze me. I'm not even bothered by it. And I need to give my child with FASD his multiplication facts every single night. And I need to put it in the same mind frame and the same idea of this is what they need to be successful. In order for your child to learn, she has to first understand what you're telling her. But sometimes a child with FASD will tell you they understand something even though they don't. Ask your child to repeat what you just taught her in her own words. Very, very helpful tool. Again, just be cautious with the teenagers that you're not doing it shameful. Be creative. Try to, make it as fun as possible. Like I mentioned, music, maybe puppet shows, maybe drawing it. Maybe there's something that they can draw to talk about different math facts or whatnot. Be as creative as they will let you, because that's a great way to teach things. Avoid cliches. So something like toe the line. That's a good one. That is way over their head. They're just not going to understand those phrases that we use that don't make any sense. So we want to make sure that we're using simple language and as few words as possible. Take baby steps. So break down the steps as much as possible. Instead of, like I've already mentioned, instead of go clean the bathroom. And when my kids were little, we had a checklist of what it looked like for the bathroom to be clean. So the bathroom is clean when the mirrors are done, the toilet's been scrubbed, the bathtub, because they just could not think of all those steps that were required to get the bathroom cleaned. And so in 2 minutes later, they were coming out and saying, okay, mom, the bathroom's clean. I'm like, is it really? And in their minds, it was. They said, oh, I wiped down the counters. It must be clean. When we wrote down that checklist of what it looked like, then they could go back to the checklist several times before they came to me to say, okay, mom, now the bathroom's clean. That helped them feel more successful and helped ease my frustration of having to go in and check the bathroom. So it helped us both by setting us both up for success. Help your child use their strengths. I can't stress that enough. I think that's really important. And then try alternative schools. Sometimes there's schools that will be better for other children. Communicate with your teachers. Let them know what works with your child and what doesn't. Maybe they need frequent breaks. Maybe they need a chair that moves more than others. My son has a chair that has a ball attached to it somehow, so he can kind of bounce up and down with it. Maybe they need a fidget toy. Whatever it is, communicate with the teachers what you've seen that has worked, so that they will have an opportunity to be more successful. And then I just am a big fan of no homework at all, but definitely to avoid excess homework or long assignments. That is very rarely helpful for any child. And it's especially not helpful with our children with FASD who are already struggling. Kind of talked about all some of these already. I like this phrase though, or this quote. It says, in your most challenging parenting moments, take a deep breath and try to remember that that moment your child is at is that their most challenging moment is your child is struggling with the most challenges. I said that a little, messed it up. In your most challenging parenting moments, take a deep breath and try to remember that the moment your child is at their most challenging is the moment your child is struggling with the most challenges. That was better. Again, our children will do as well as they can. Our children are wired for connection. They're wired to want to connect with us. And so when we're having tensions with them, they don't like it any more than we like it. And so we need to remember that they will do as well as they can. When we're talking about friends, and this is something that's really important because it's important to our kids, right? So we want to supervise. Again, we need to remember the developmental level. So they may have another 11-year-old playing with them, but our child may not be at that level. And so we just need to be offering a little bit more supervision than we normally would without doing the shaming, which I get that balance is really difficult. But just make sure that you're supervising your child and giving them that enough structure so that they feel safe and contained, but also enough space that they feel like they're, that you're trusting them and they're working on their independence as well. But supervising is really important. So maybe that means you go to a park to have the play date so you can watch them a little bit more. Or maybe, we just have a rule in our home that no doors are shut. And we don't make that a rule for the little kids versus the big kids. We just make it a rule across the board. But make sure someone is supervising, because our kids that have, the poor impulse control and the short-term memories, they're going to need someone to step in when things are not getting safe, when things are not safe, or when things are getting a little out of hand. And if we just say, oh, well, he's 12, he should be able to handle himself on the playground. And yet we know that every time he goes on the playground unsupervised, someone's going to come in and tattletale on him, then you're just setting him up for failure. So make sure that you're changing the environment, not expecting your child to make the changes. Give helpful reminders. So my son just went over to play at a friend's house today, and I said, okay, now you're gonna make sure that you share, instead of just saying you need to be polite or mind your manners. It's like, okay, you're gonna share. So that means you're gonna take turns on the video game thing. And then if you need to say, say please and thank you. So there was, a lot of prompting that needed to be done versus just saying, okay, make good choices or mind your manners. I needed to remind him what I was looking for in minding your manners or making good choices. So that was sharing, that was talking appropriately, whatever the child may need that extra reminder on. Role playing is great. That can really be helpful to a child to try out a new friendship or a new social skill without the stress of peers actually around them. So that's something that you can do in your own home. Hey, how would you handle this if someone offered you drugs? Or how would you handle it if you saw something that you shouldn't be watching on TV? Let's act that out. If you get to a certain age, again, that's not going to be fun for them. They're not going to enjoy that. So hopefully you have some time to do that early on. But it can also be something that you're texting. Hey, I was watching TV yesterday and I saw that this one girl saw something on TV, and then she texted her mom about it. What do you think about us doing something like that? Or what would you do if that happened? Role playing can look different at different ages. So if you need to do it through text, that's okay. If they're going to understand that better, then do it at their level so they don't have to feel any shame at all, but help them think through what they would do before they get into that circumstance. That's actually good advice for any kid, because when we have peers coming around, sometimes they'll make choices that they wouldn't have otherwise made if they already have their decision made up before they even get into the situation. Let's see, know what's going, educate your child about sex. You want to be the ones having those conversations with them, even more so with a child with FASD. So if they are chronologically 16, they're going to have some of those same feelings of a 16-year-old boy or girl, but yet they're developmentally 10. They could get into some really sticky situations there that you want to avoid. And so that's why it's really even more so than with our other children that we're having these conversations. Have them developmentally appropriate, so not chronologically appropriate, developmentally. But make sure that you're having these conversations so that they know what to do and say in certain circumstances. Make sure that we're using the proper terminology for their body parts, because again, that's where it can get really confusing for a child who already has difficult time with comprehension if we're using different terms. Make sure that they have a very specific plan of what they're going to do if X, Y, and Z happens. Because all of these situations are just much more likely to happen when you have a child that has poor impulse control and struggles with memory, and maybe chronologically is different than developmentally. Our children who have already been abused and are in foster care are also much more likely to be abused in any of these ways too. So once a child has been abused once, their rates of being abused again go up. So we want to make sure that we're having these conversations with them and monitoring things. And then I don't have a lot of time and I'm talking a lot, and I apologize about that. If any of you guys have questions, please jump in. And so I considered not talking about this, but I think it's so important that I thought I'm just going to talk about it real quick, because I think you guys, that term self-care is thrown out there a lot nowadays, and we have a whole class on self-care. So if you need to know more about this subject, please look into it. But I didn't want to skip it because it's so important. We cannot care for children that need us to be 100% all the time without taking care of ourselves. So our kids need that extra support from us to be successful. They're not going to be successful without us giving them a lot of support. And sometimes that support goes much further into their lives than maybe we were anticipate giving them. So again, if we have a child who's chronologically 17, but more like a 12-year-old, we're going to have to be supporting that child much longer than we anticipated, which is why it's so important that we're taking care of ourselves, because it really is true that you can't pour from an empty cup. And so make sure that you're connecting with other families who are affected by FASD. Right there, I have a great Facebook group that you can Google, Utah FASD. They have some get-togethers in different areas. They have some great trainings. And then it's just nice to know you're not alone, that you're not the only one going through some of these problems, that your children are not the only ones putting holes in the walls or whatever the case may be. As I just love knowing that someone out there gets me. And so I encourage you to, however that looks for you, if you're not Facebook fan, find friends that are, that have some experience and know what you're going through. Find people that get you and your child and that don't have any of the shame going on there. Do your best, but don't try to be perfect. None of us are going to be. All of us are going to have bad days. All of our kids are going to have bad days. So make sure that, I'm already, by being here tonight, I've already said, I think you're doing great, and so awesome that you're taking time out to learn about this kind of stuff. But you're not going to remember everything I talked about. You're not going to be able to go and do it perfectly. Just try to do a little bit better than you did yesterday. That's always my goal for myself and my goal for my kids. And then find some people to talk to and network. It's just really important that you're taking care of yourself. I can't stress that enough. We're almost done here. I kind of already talked about it, but I teach the TBRI class for Utah Foster Care as well. And kind of the new phrase that's coming out there is this trauma-informed parenting. And that's kind of how we want to go forward with all of our kids that have been exposed to trauma, right? But they're actually finding out, there was a great article that I found from a study that was in 2019, so just very recently, that said, they concluded that if a person has FASD and has experienced trauma, they tend to be functionally more similar to children with just FASD than they are to children with just trauma. That was really eye-opening to me, because a lot of times we talk about being trauma-informed, and that will kind of help with all of the issues that a child has. But this study says that without overlooking trauma, it may be best to think of these children's difficulties as being caused primarily by prenatal exposure to alcohol, and to use the strategies that are designed for fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Traditional parenting strategies for trauma or attachment may backfire on a child with FASD, as these strategies concentrate more on rebuilding neural pathways for a different outcome. Because if we remember correctly, TBRI and a lot of this trauma-informed parenting is all about that rebuilding those pathways. Unfortunately, with FASD, there's no rebuilding. It's brain damage that's been done. There are, and I don't want to not give hope, there are ways that we can, and we've just gone through a lot of them, lots of different skills, lots of different ways that we can adapt the environment to help our child be successful. But it's not really about relearning the brain, it's more about adapting the environment. And so we need to recognize that it's, again, not a can't do, or I get those confused, that it's not a won't do, it's a can't do. And we need to adjust either our expectations or our task so that our children can be successful. So we need to think brain damage. When we're being an FASD informed parent, we need to think about brain damage and change that mindset into it's not that they're trying to be bad or push my buttons, it's really that there's brain damage that's been done. Be curious. Now, this is something that TBRI talks about and trauma-informed parenting talks about a lot. So this is one of those crossovers. Be curious. Ask why, what's going on here? Why are you doing the things you're doing? What am I not saying the right way? What more supports do we need to give you? Ask them what they need. Ask them what they're not understanding. And then listen. Sometimes I will do the first part and then I'll forget to do the last part. And I'll be like, okay, I asked you, now I'm moving on to what I think would make this situation better. Often our kids are really smart. They can come up with some really good things that would really be helpful to them to help in the environment. So be curious and then also listen. Adjust your expectations. I think I've already talked about that quite a bit, but make sure that you have those expectations that are realistic, because that's setting your child up for success, and you're more likely to feel successful too if your child's being successful. Be ready to change the environment. So again, change the environment, not the child, because remember, you can't change their brain. Goes back up to the first one, it's brain damage. So you can absolutely teach them skills and you can absolutely make adaptations to the environment, but you can't force their brain to work a certain way when there's been brain damage. And so when you make that mind shift, it's a little bit easier to understand that this may be something that you're doing for a while. You may have to do math facts for a long, long time. But if that's what your child needs to be successful, then you as a parent who are taking good care of yourself are going to be more willing to be able to provide that for your child. So work on becoming an FASD informed parent, and working on, some of those trauma things I still think are very helpful. I'm still a big TBRI fan. I think there's a lot of things that we can do there that can really help our children. But I do think looking at it from an FASD point of view will be really helpful too. So kind of things there. Real quick, just to sum up here, there are some alternative approaches that you can also try. So moving away from, the parent and the behavior modification. I know we've tried biofeedback, which is really helpful. It's kind of getting the right brain and the left brain to kind of be more in sync. Animal assistant therapy has been incredibly helpful for one of my children, equine therapy, and it's getting more and more covered by Medicaid, which is really nice. Yoga and exercise, those breathing, that can be very helpful for us as parents too. I was just listening to a podcast on FASD, and they were saying how important it is that we have respite, and they were saying how hard that is to find sometimes, right? And they said, even if we as parents can just take a deep breath, that is respite. I mean, obviously we want to get to more of the long-term respite where we could get a break from the child, but even just taking a deep breath. So teaching our kids to take a deep breath and learn to start self-regulating can be really helpful. And yoga can be really helpful for that as well. As always, I'm just going to stress, before starting any treatment, make sure you check it out carefully and talk to your child's doctor and caseworker. We have done the smells, which I thought was just kind of, I'm not really a new agey person, I guess. So I thought kind of those smells would be kind of weird. My kids really responded well to some of those herbal essence stuff, vitamins, art therapy, having my child with FASD who struggles with expressive and receptive language sit and talk to a therapist, it did no good because it was just too hard for him to understand and comprehend everything that she was saying. When she got out the sound therapy, that went much better. He really likes art therapy, so that went much better. So be willing, you know, some of these things are a little out there, but there's some that can be really helpful for our child. So, you know, look at some of those alternative approaches as well. This was one site that I just can't resist sharing with you guys because I thought it was so cool. Again, you can just go up to the top there. I think it's This Is Me. This talked about FASD from a child's point of view. And it had some cute short videos on their strengths, on some things that might be difficult for them, on some strategies to help them be successful. And what I really liked is it was something that was really strength-based and was really on their level. So when my kids were kind of that preteen, I kind of looked for ways to talk to them about FASD because it can be a kind of hard topic to have with them. But if we can have these hard conversations, it says that the kids will be much more successful. In fact, there was a quote here that I was going to read. No, maybe I didn't get it down. It just said something about the kids having realistic expectations on themselves being really important. So really making sure that they understand their disability too. And I just thought this website did a really great job of doing that to that preteen age group. And so this was a cool website I wanted to make sure to share with you guys. There are some quotes here that I thought were really great too, as we're finishing up here, that you guys can read. One of them that I really like is this Dr. Ross Green. He's written The Explosive Child, which is a great book. It's not specifically for children with FASD, but it is really helpful for children who have behavior issues. And he says, no one thinks punishment will teach a child math or how to read. And so why do we put behavior in a different category of developmental delays is beyond me. You know, we don't give a kid consequences when they can't figure out how to read. We encourage to teach them. We remodel it for them. We give them more opportunities to learn how to read. No one would ever think of saying, you know, you're not reading well enough, so you can't go out to recess. But we do that all the time with our kids that can't sit still very long. So making that mind shift is really, really important. And then in the end, I'll just finish up with children do well if they can. If they can't, we adults need to figure out what's getting in the way so we can help. And so I don't know if that's kind of my presentation. Does anyone have any questions or comments or anything? Anything to add that you have found really helpful? Because I would love getting advice and ideas.
Well,
Yeah,
So there's one thing that I actually just started doing only back in May with my kids. So I have, of course, my two with FASD and then my two biological. One of them has OCD and then the other one has autism. So I've got all sorts of spectrums in my house, but a lot of them seem to share a lot of similar executive dysfunction behaviors. And so when you were talking about that whole like, oh, tell them the things that they need, like the same way every day, break it down. I just wanted to share with you guys something that's been working for us really well. Bear in mind that all of these kids that use these apps, they are 13, 16, 16, and 17. So they are older, but there is an app called Habitica, like Habitica, and it is a role-playing game that is a to-do list. And I can log in and put things on my kids' to-do lists. So hang on, I just kind of, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make my phone show you guys an example, but like there's habits. And so for my little one with FASD, she has to remember, for example, she gnaws on the sides of her fingers. So I have keep fingers away from your mouth. If she does that, she can click it. She gets a little gold coin for her little guy. She has to remember to drink water because she doesn't remember that. So every time she drinks a cup of water, she can click, she can get little money. Like she loves Minecraft. And so this kind of feeds into that because it's, I don't know, let me see if we can, I don't think you guys can see it. It's like, just, oh wait, there we go. There we go.
Awesome.
So you see
That
it's
is
like
so
a little,
cool.
it's a little game, but yeah, so there's habits and then there's the dailies. And this is where, when you're talking about that, so for example, this week she's got tidy the dining room. And when you click on tidy the dining room, there's a whole set of check marks. And so there's clear off the table, put things away. If they don't go in the kitchen, put them where they go. Put away the shoes under the table. If you know whose they are, put it by their door. Wipe off the table with a damp paper towel. Catch the crumbs in your hand, then put them in the trash can. Wipe down the fridge handles and the water and ice dispenser if they're yucky. So like it's got a whole series of little like, oh, is that one? Yeah, okay. And I even have sweep the floor. Yes, every day. Remember those crumbs you didn't catch earlier? That's where they went. So like,
So did you type up those additional things? So you
yes.
did. That is
Yeah,
so
I
cool.
typed them all in. I basically looked at all the stuff that my kids were forgetting. And I was like, well, how about instead of yelling at them, it literally, it just repopulates every day. The dailies pop back up. And so I just say, have you done your chores? And they're like, and I'm like, go check the app. And then it's like, oh, that's right. I do this one first, this one first, this one next, you know, and then like I have, you know, tidy your bedroom. I ask for 4 things in the room. I did include, like, I put fun things on here too. So it's not all like, chores. So I have like, tell mom a good joke. Please don't tell me the same one every day. And if it's too dumb, I might stick my tongue out at you. So that way there's, you know, like I try to make it lighthearted, and it's been working especially well for Riley, like my FASD daughter. She's probably the most on the ball, even though she has the most deficits. And after listening to you talk about that, I'm like, well, this plays into all of those. It reminds her without shame. It does it the same way every day. I can break it down and put those check marks in there. And I'm like, oh, yay, I found a thing. It worked.
Yes. And thank you so much for sharing that. My son will love something like that. So I wrote it down. I'm going to go. That's why I love teaching. You guys teach me so much. I love that. Thank you so much. That's something that would really be helpful for my son. And like you said, very not shaming for the older group. So
yeah, exactly.
And I love too that it kind of takes that power struggle out of it, because you just say, go check the app. And so it's not, and then they can be successful. And anytime we can give our kids a chance to be successful, that increases their self-esteem, increases the chances that they'll do it again next time. I mean, it's just, you know, multiple positive things from it. Thank you so much for sharing.
You're
Anyone
welcome.
else? Good ideas or questions? Okay.
Amy?
Yeah.
Just a question. Do you see similar situations with kids exposed to meth that you do? Or is it usually a package deal, meth, alcohol, tobacco?
Yes and no. So I have kids who were exposed to meth, and they often So what I've noticed is that their adolescent years is very difficult, and that their impulse control is, and impulse control and their moods are kind of more severe. So, you know, all teenagers are kind of going up and down with their moods all the time anyhow. My kids that were exposed to meth, their moods were so much more extreme, you know, much quicker up and much quicker down, and highs and lowers. But they did well academically. They did pretty well socially. Whereas my children who were exposed to alcohol will probably all need some supports throughout their lives. So I definitely think it affects them differently. I know, you know, my child that was exposed to meth had a lot of health issues when she was a baby. So asthma, RSV, she still struggles with some of those things, but overall, and I think this is interesting because as a society, we get much more upset with mothers who use meth than we do with mothers who drink, right? But as overall, my kids that were exposed to alcohol have fared, I don't know if worse is the word I'd use, but there's much more negative impacts on their life than my children who were exposed to meth, and much more long-term.
Okay. I think
However, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think we have all three: tobacco, alcohol, and meth. And we have 4 children exposed to it, ranging in age from 14 to 2.
Wow.
And, yeah, so.
And that was going to be my next comment, is that a lot of times when they're using meth, they also use alcohol. So I think it's kind of, you go back to that thing with trauma, that it's just a better option just to assume that there's probably some exposure to alcohol, and to treat as it is. And I think you should treat this with all kids, that they're doing the best that they can do, and that we need to wrap around supports from them. So I don't know that if it matters, if it was cigarettes, you know, tobacco, meth, or alcohol, or trauma, or autism. I think we need to, as parents, we need to assume that our children are doing the best they can. And when they're not, that's when we as the adults in their lives need to help build the environment to help them be successful.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. Great question though, because I think that's a lot of times what people run up against with children in foster care, especially. So any other questions? I will show you how to get credit real quick, and then I will let you guys go. And then if there's any questions, I'll stay on here for a second. So if you go